Gosh, what a week. Alright, let's do this. Happening now. Sort of. Let me preface this segment by saying that this story is incredibly complex and goes beyond the events that have happened and are currently happening in the one country I'm going to be mostly focusing on. But for the sake of time constraints and perspective, I want to keep it as simple as possible. In case you're not sure what the subject is, I'm talking about the current conflict in Ukraine. So let's start with the backstory to this and provide the facts as they've been given. To do so, we have to go back to late 2013. It was back then that Ukraine's then president, Viktor Yanukovych, was faced with a difficult decision. Ever since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, many former Soviet nations, not named Russia, have somewhat found themselves in the precarious position of whether to incorporate themselves into the European Union, pursue closer economic ties with Russia, or stay mostly neutral and try to get the best of both worlds. Yanukovych was faced with the same choice in 2013. You see, at the time, Russian President Vladimir Putin had been attempting to form his own economic union, the Eurasian Economic Union, which at the time was to be comprised of Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan, and Ukraine if they decided to join. Alternatively, Ukraine was offered an opportunity to associate with the European Union, which could have been the start to a path at Ukraine becoming a member of the EU. Ultimately, Yanukovych decided to shy away from associating with the EU and instead decided to pursue closer ties with the Russian Federation. His decision was not taken well by some Ukrainians in the western part of the nation, so they took to the streets to protest the decision and show their support to pursuing closer ties with Europe, known as the Euromaidan protests, which began in November of 2013. Meanwhile, in the east of Ukraine, there were portions of the population opposed to the Euromaidan protests who were in support of Yanukovych's decision. Over time, the Euromaidan protests started to entail a wider amount of demonstrations, calling for more than just closer ties with the European Union, but also calls for the resignation of Yanukovych and his government due to suspicions of corruption. Violence escalated in January of 2014 when, in response to anti-protest laws, the demonstrators began to occupy buildings in the center of Kiev. Riots began occurring, and 98 people died from the 18th to the 20th of February. This caused the Ukrainian parliament on February 22nd to deem Yanukovych unable to fulfill his duties as president. Citing constitutional powers, they removed him from power and set an election for May 25th to determine a successor. This set into motion a chain of events with far-reaching effects. First, Yanukovych and his family flee to Russia upon his removal from power, and criminal charges are made against him for ordering the mass murder of civilians in the Euromaidan riots. Russia, starting to see that it's losing Ukraine, goes on the offensive by moving in unmarked armed soldiers into the Crimean Peninsula, which had a large amount of Russian speakers living there. In March, Putin receives authorization from the Russian parliament after making a request to deploy Russian troops to Ukraine, and takes control of Crimea for the sake of establishing order on the peninsula. A referendum is held in Crimea. No outside parties are able to monitor it, so it's still contested whether the vote was legitimate or enforced by the armed soldiers. Nevertheless, the referendum calls for the incorporation with Russia, and by mid to late March, Russia effectively annexed Crimea from Ukraine. At this point, the international community goes into a frenzy at Russia's actions, and several steps are taken by the US and some European nations to impose economic punishment onto Russia for its actions. But that's a story for another day. Back in Ukraine now, the eastern half of the mainland, which was in favor of Yanukovych's decision, decides it wants to secede from Ukraine, presumably in the hopes of following Crimea's lead and taking to be incorporated into Russia. Unrest starts up in the eastern Ukraine, and armed militias start to occupy buildings now in Luhansk and Donetsk. This later spreads to Kharkiv and Odessa. The newly elected Ukrainian president at the time, Petro Poroshenko, realizes that the Ukraine could be splintered further unless action is taken. Also, he is facing pressure from the European Union in having to put down the unrests in the east and getting the situation under control, or the agreements could be in jeopardy. So, Poroshenko is essentially faced with no other option but to confront the separatists with hardline force. Things enter murky territory now as accusations start to arise that Russia, in pursuing its national interests, is supplying the eastern Ukrainian separatists with weapons, arms, and even sneaking in Russian troops to keep the conflict occurring. Accusations also arise by Russia's President Putin that the US and Western European nations orchestrated the Euromaidan protests and that the removal of Yanukovych was to sabotage Ukraine from entering the Eurasian Union. So for almost 9 months. Since March of 2014, this conflict has been going on in eastern Ukraine. And in those 9 months, several things have happened. An airliner plane was shot down in East Ukraine carrying 298 people, all of which died. The passengers were of various nationalities, a large portion of them being Dutch, but the general consensus is that the eastern separatists and Russia are to blame for this incident. The Ukraine government and separatists have seen military setbacks each. There have been several meetings to try and negotiate a ceasefire. One was agreed upon in September 5th of 2014, but it's essentially been ignored. For a long time, though, almost since the start of the eastern Ukraine conflict, the Ukrainian government's troops have been defending a besieged airport in Donetsk since May of 2014. That 8-month siege has since ended, as this past Thursday it was reported that Ukraine's troops were withdrawing from the now military-shattered ruins of what was at one time the country's second busiest airport. I mean, the pictures speak for themselves. This airport is now just ruins of what it once was. And that's essentially, in a nutshell, the simplified version of what's been happening in the Ukraine conflict, without going too far back into the nitty-gritty international stakes involved and whatnot. Here's where we go into the opinion and speculation. A lot of observers are starting to wonder whether this could be the turning point that sees the Ukraine government eventually lose eastern Ukraine to the separatists. The loss of the airport for many is a blow to morale, and Russia is believed to be increasing its support to the separatists as of late, and the airport could be used in the future as a means for Russia to airlift more supplies to the separatists. Where do I stand on this? Well, for starters, I don't necessarily believe either side is in the right, so to speak. But I do believe the Ukrainians, in Western Ukraine, in a sense are fighting to keep their nation together, in the hopes of maintaining national sovereignty from Russia. I don't know whether Ukraine can come back from the setback of losing the airport, but it's definitely not looking good. But by no means is this over. That airport is hardly worth celebrating over. I mean, it's in fucking ruins. I am worried, however, about the implication this conflict could have for other former Soviet nations in Europe. Between the annexation by Russia of Crimea last year and Russia's role in further destabilizing Ukraine, this is setting a bad precedent in favor of Russia doing whatever it wants. The apparent paralysis of the United States and United Kingdom in not upholding the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in response to Russia's actions, as they promised they would in the Budapest Memorandum on security assurances, hurts their credibility. By proxy, this also hurts the credibility of NATO's defensive capabilities and military readiness should member nations bordering Russia face similar troubles in the future. Things are looking bleak, folks. I'm not trying to put forth an alarmist perspective, but when it comes to this, if you aren't paying attention to the situation, you probably should start to. Even if you don't agree with my perspective or the views of others on it, get informed. I provided a list of several links in the description to further find out about the topic, and I encourage you to check them out. Okay, on to something a little less disheartening. You probably recognize this segment because let's talk internet. No, hold on. This isn't a rant. I know the past two segments were, but by no means was this segment intended to just be ranting against the internet. I mean, if you look at the segment screen, it's got hearts on it, for crying out loud. That's because deep down, I love the internet. And when you love something, you want the best for it, which is why I've pointed out some of its negatives in the past, because I want it to improve on the areas that could use improvement. But obviously, there must have been some great things about it to make me like it as well, right? Well, yeah, and I wanted to highlight one today. It's that the internet has a ton of hilarious pictures available to provide a person with a pick-me-up when they're feeling down. Specifically, comic strips. Oh, those are the best. So if you're ever in need of a pick-me-up, Lord knows I could use one at times, feel free to check out some of the links in the descriptions for some funny webcomic pages. And if you know a few that I don't mention, recommend me some. I'll check them out and add them in the description as well. Webcomics aren't the only humorous reading material you can enjoy. There are also plenty of books with some humor in them, and I thought I'd suggest one for you to check out. So, here's a recommendation. This book is also a play and is based upon a real individual and a real event. The book is called The Night Thoreau Spent in Jail by Robert Edwin Lee and Jerome Lawrence. It follows the early life of Henry David Thoreau during the early 19th century, following the story leading up to his being jailed for a night. Thoreau holds many titles. I think that's actually something he mentions in dialogue at one point. But two titles I thought I'd mention are that he is an abolitionist and a philosopher. Neither one of those is particularly correlated as to why he's in jail. However, as the story does take place prior to the Civil War, you can imagine the abolitionist title might have something to do with it. The story has various themes, really, some of which are still as relevant today as they were back then, including the role of government and its people, citizens and their ability to engage in civil disobedience, the relationship between man and nature, the importance of education, and concern that taxes can go to funding unwanted wars in foreign lands. It's got its share of humor and wit and is a fairly short read, so I definitely recommend checking it out. Well, that wraps up things rather nicely for this installment of Another Point of View. Unless I go out in a blaze of glory of some kind or we all get consumed by hellfire, I guess I'll see you next time. Try not to do anything rash for the week. That goes for you as well as me. And take care, everyone.
I am the god of hellfire, and I bring you fire.